and we're walking up this red carpet to meet Princess Diana, and I got me.
Hollywood woke up that morning wrapped in a kind of silence it had never known before. No flashing cameras, no laughter, no applause, just one piece of news spreading quietly and breaking hearts as it went. Rob Reiner was gone, and so was his wife, Michelle. Not after a long illness, not in a peaceful sleep, but inside their own home in a way no one could have imagined. For decades, Rob Reiner had been the man who told us stories about love, loyalty, friendship, and the fragile beauty of being human. He made the world laugh. He made people believe in happy endings. And now his own story had ended in unimaginable darkness. Phones started ringing before the sun fully rose. Whispers turned into stunned silence. And somewhere in Los Angeles, one man received a call that would change the rest of his life. Billy Crystal. Those close to him would later say the moment he heard the news, he didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He just grabbed his coat and drove straight to Rob's house. Because years earlier, Billy had once said something through tears that now felt terrifyingly prophetic. I don't know how to live in a world without Rob. And now he was about to find out. But what happened next at the house, at the private farewell, and on a quiet beach in Malibu would leave even Hollywood's strongest voices completely speechless. So what really happened at Rob Reiner's final goodbye? Who was there when the cameras were kept away? And what did Billy Crystal say when he stood up to say farewell to the closest friend of his life? That story begins right now. When Billy Crystal arrived at the house in Brentwood, the street was already sealed off. Police tape stretched across the familiar driveway. Flashing lights reflected against the walls of a home he had walked into countless times before. A place filled with laughter, dinners that lasted too long, arguments about movies that never truly ended. But this time, the house felt like a stranger. Billy stepped out of the car and froze. Those who witnessed the moment later said he stood there silently, staring at the front door, unable to move, as if his body understood something his mind refused to accept. This wasn't just a house. This was where Rob had welcomed him like family, where Michelle had smiled quietly in the background, grounding everything with warmth and calm, where decades of friendship had lived and breathed. Billy raised his hand, then lowered it. He covered his face and broke down completely. No cameras were there, no microphones, no audience to perform for, just a man who had lost the person who knew him better than anyone else alive. Years earlier, Rob had once said something to Billy, half joking, half serious. If I ever go first, Rob had smiled, you better stand up and say a few words for me. They laughed back then, because that's what friends do when the idea of goodbye feels impossible. Standing in front of that door now, the memory returned with crushing force. That joke had turned into a promise, and that promise had become the heaviest burden Billy had ever carried. Inside the house, everything felt suspended in time. The air was thick, the silence unbearable. Billy stayed only a short while, about 30 minutes. He said nothing to reporters, avoided every camera, no statements, no explanations. As he turned away to leave, he paused once more, his back facing the house. Witnesses later said it looked as if he was afraid that if he turned around again, he would never find a strength to walk away. And as the car pulled off, Billy stared straight ahead, eyes hollow, understanding one painful truth. Some roles you never step out of, and some grief stays with you forever. As the shock began to spread across Hollywood, many expected the usual ritual, a public memorial, rows of cameras, speeches streamed across every screen. But the Reiner family chose something radically different. There would be no public ceremony, no press, no headlines fighting for attention, only a private farewell. The decision came up quickly, born not from a strategy, but from grief too heavy to carry in front of the world. They explained this was not a final goodbye, and only the first one, held while the pain was still raw, while shock still hadn't loosened its grip. 5 days after Rob and Michelle were found, the family gathered quietly, December 19th, before dawn, on a secluded beach in Malibu. It was a place Rob and Michelle loved deeply, a place they had spoken about often, somewhere peaceful where the sunrise felt honest and unforced, somewhere the ocean breathed slowly, the way they always hoped life would. That morning, the beach was wrapped in gray mist. The waves rolled in gently like careful footsteps. The air felt heavy but calm, as if nature itself had chosen to stand still. No crowds gathered, no distant whispers, only the sound of water and the weight of loss. Their daughter took on the hardest task of all. She made the calls herself. One by one, she reached out to those who truly knew her parents, not as legends, but as people. Her voice shook, but she was steady. "My parents wanted us to meet one last time," she told them, "at the beach they loved." Each call came with long pauses, deep breaths, tears she tried to hold back, especially when she called Billy Crystal. She also contacted Rob's closest friends, Larry David, Albert Brooks, Norman Lear. Even Barack and Michelle Obama were quietly notified. Friends who had once sat in the Reiner home, sharing stories far from the spotlight. No one spoke long, no one asked questions, everyone understood. This was not about Hollywood. This was about love. While the calls were being made, Rob's son focused on the details. Simple seating, soft lighting, white flowers, candles placed carefully against the wind. "No noise, no media," he said firmly. They wanted peace. As the first light of morning broke through the mist, the wet sand shimmered softly, almost like tears left behind by the night. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was heartbreakingly quiet. And slowly, one by one, the people who loved Rob and Michelle began to arrive. The first guests arrived without speaking. No one rushed. No one smiled the way they usually did in public. They walked slowly across cold, wet sand as if every step had to be earned. There were no loud greetings, only quiet embraces, red-rimmed eyes, hands holding hands a little tighter than normal. Some carried old photographs, edges softened from years of being touched. Others brought books Rob had once signed, and many brought nothing at all because grief, when it's real, doesn't need props. The mist stayed low, wrapping everything in gray. Even the ocean seemed to move differently that morning. Each wave rolled in like a slow breath, then retreated, like it was trying not to disturb the living. The ceremonial space was simple. Candles, white flowers, soft light catching on the damp sand, no stage, no spotlight, just two coffins resting quietly near the edge of the sea. And that's when the truth became unavoidable. This wasn't just the loss of a director. This was the end of a love story, the end of a partnership that had carried a family, carried friendships, carried decades of meaning. The beach felt like a room full of memories that couldn't speak. People stood still, staring out toward the water, as if the horizon might offer a reason, any reason, why this had happened the way it did. A few whispered names under their breath. Rob, Michelle, and then the crowd began to shift. Not with excitement, not with curiosity, with something heavier. Because up the narrow path leading down to the beach, someone was approaching. Everyone recognized the silhouette immediately. Billy Crystal. He walked slowly alongside his wife, Janice, as if every step took effort. He wore a plain white shirt and dark sunglasses, hiding eyes that had clearly cried too much in too few days. Janice held his hand tightly, not gently, firmly, like an anchor keeping him upright. In his free hand, Billy carried something that turned the air even colder. A faded navy blue baseball cap, a New York Yankees logo on the front. People noticed it at once, because many remembered seeing Rob wear that exact cap through the 1980s, back when life still felt wide open, back when laughter came easily, back when their stories were still being written. Rob had once joked it was his lucky charm, and Billy had kept it all these years, like a piece of a friendship he never believed would end like this. As Billy stepped closer, people instinctively moved aside. No one wanted to interrupt that moment, because what Billy carried wasn't just a hat, it was a memory, and he was about to place it into the hands of a family that had just lost everything. Billy stopped just a few steps from the family. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of the waves filled a space where words could not. The wind brushed softly against the candles, threatening but never daring to extinguish them. Billy looked at Rob's children. His hand trembled slightly as he held out the faded Yankees cap. "Your dad told me to hold on to this," he said quietly. His voice barely carried above the ocean. He paused, swallowing hard. He said one day he'd want it back, to remember the happy days by the sea. No one spoke. Roy's hands reached out slowly, almost afraid to touch it. Jake stood beside her, gripping her hand tightly, as if letting go might cause something else to fall apart. Tears filled their eyes, not the kind that rushed out, but the kind that stayed, heavy and burning. "He was always like that," someone whispered, "always thinking ahead, always trying to leave warmth behind." Time seemed to slow. Billy stepped closer to the coffins. He rested his hand gently on the wood. Then he leaned down and whispered something no one else could hear. Whatever he said belonged only to three people now: Rob, Michelle, and Billy. Janice stood beside him, tears running freely down her face. She didn't try to hide them. She didn't need to. She placed a hand on Billy's back, steady and silent, offering a strength without interrupting his goodbye. The beach felt frozen. No one dared to breathe too loudly. And then, slowly, Billy turned away from the coffins. The hardest part was still ahead, because he hadn't come only to say goodbye in private. He had come to keep a promise. And when Billy Crystal stepped toward the small podium facing the sea, everyone understood the same thing at once. This wasn't going to be a speech. This was going to be a man saying farewell to half of his life. When Billy Crystal stepped behind the podium, the entire beach seemed to stop breathing. No one shifted their weight. No one looked away. This wasn't a comedian standing in front of them. This wasn't a public figure. This was a man who had just lost the person who had walked beside him for nearly his entire adult life. Billy stood still for a long moment, both hands gripping the edges of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He lowered his head, took a deep breath, and then his voice broke. "I've thought a lot about what I should say today," he began. He paused, not for effect, not for drama, because the words simply wouldn't come. "I realized there are no words big enough. He continued softly, when your best friend is no longer sitting in the front row, laughing, teasing you, saying, "Oh, hey, Billy, don't take everything so seriously." A quiet sob echoed across the sand. Billy glanced toward the two flower-covered coffins. For a moment, he couldn't look back. "We met in 1975, he said, his voice trembling. "We were cast as best friends, even though we'd never met. After the first day, we looked at each other and said, 'This feels right. Why don't we just be best friends in real life, too?'" He shook his head gently, smiling through tears. And just like that, he whispered, 50 years passed. The crowd broke. Some lowered their heads, others wiped their faces, already soaked with tears. Billy spoke about late-night dinners, long conversations about family, fears they never shared publicly. Rob was the first person who made me feel like I didn't have to perform in real life, he said. If I was scared, he told me to just say it. "We'll laugh at it," he'd say. Billy paused again, and somehow, he smiled faintly, he was always right. The tension in the air shifted. Grief softened into memory. He spoke about the early years, the trust, the way Rob gave him freedom as an artist, and more importantly, as a friend. There were moments, Billy said, when a single glance from Rob told me everything. No explanations, no doubt, just understanding. Then he reached the moment that changed everything. When Harry met Sally, Billy smiled again, but this time it hurt to watch. "We sat in the back row at the first screening," he recalled, "holding hands like kids, not sure if we'd done something as special." He swallowed hard. When the room erupted in laughter, he said quietly, Rob leaned over and whispered, "We did it, Billy." Billy stopped speaking. Tears fell freely now. "That moment," he said at last, "will stay with me forever." By the time he finished, there was no applause, only the sound of the ocean and a beach full of people realizing they had just witnessed something far greater than a eulogy. They had witnessed love saying goodbye. When Billy stepped away from the podium, no one moved. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, shared, sacred. The waves continued their slow rhythm, beating like a heart that refused to stop even as everything else felt broken. Then, quietly, someone stood. Meg Ryan. She didn't rush. She didn't smile. She had stood still for a long moment, hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes red, gathering the strength to speak. "Rob taught me something I didn't know I needed," she said softly. "That love doesn't have to be perfect." Her voice cracked. "He just said, let them talk like real people." She swallowed hard. That changed my life. No one needed her to say more. Everyone there remembered the stories Rob helped bring to life, the conversations that felt real, the love that felt honest. Next, Stephen King stepped forward, tall, quiet, carrying his grief like a weight he was used to holding. He didn't speak right away. He looked out at the ocean, bowed his head, then finally said, "Rob was one of the few people who could see light in the darkest stories I write." His voice trembled. He wasn't afraid of sadness. He didn't run from fear. The waves rolled in behind him as he continued. "He only ever asked me one thing," Stephen said. "Are we being honest?" The truth of that question settled over the crowd like fog. Then Kathy Bates approached the podium. Her eyes were swollen, her notes crumpled in shaking hands. "Rob believed in me," she said, tears falling freely, even when I didn't believe in myself. She paused, breathing hard. He looked at me and said, "Go a little further, Kathy. I'm right here." Her voice broke completely. "And I went further?" Because of him? Albert Brooks followed. He tried to smile. It didn't last. Rob and I laughed together for almost our entire lives, he said quietly. And today, the hardest part is realizing I don't know who I'm supposed to laugh with anymore. A wave of quiet sobs moved through the crowd. Then came Martin Short. No notes, no paper, just trembling hands. We talk a lot about Rob's talent, he said softly, but what made me love him was his kindness. He swallowed hard. He listened. He remembered your name. He stayed until the very end. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, Rob, you made this world better, and now it's emptier without you. Tears fell everywhere. No one tried to hide them anymore, because by then everyone understood the same truth. Rob Reiner wasn't being remembered for awards or fame. He was being remembered for how he made people feel, and that was his greatest legacy. After the final speaker stepped away, no one stood up immediately. It wasn't hesitation, it was disbelief. As if everyone was still trying to understand how a man like Rob Reiner and a woman like Michelle could be gone in a single brutal moment. Then Roy stepped forward. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall. She wasn't speaking as a public figure. She wasn't speaking for Hollywood. She was speaking as a daughter who had just lost her parents and was now carrying their final words like glass in her hands. Her voice cracked as she read something they had written long before this day. Live well, she read softly. Love one another, and don't forget to laugh every day. A low sound of grief moved through the crowd, half sob, half breath. Roy continued, fighting tears with every sentence. We are leaving, but we hope you will continue to see the light, even in dark days. Each word sounded like it was being pulled straight from her chest. Jake stood beside her the entire time. He said very little, but his eyes told the whole story. He adjusted candles when the wind tried to take them. He steadied flowers when the ocean air shifted. Tiny movements, because when your world collapses, sometimes all you can do is fix small things just to stay standing. At one point, he leaned toward Roy and whispered, barely audible, everything will be okay. We're keeping our promise to them. When Roy finished, she stepped back, and something strange happened. No music played, no applause came, no closing words were offered to wrap it up, because nothing could. The ceremony ended the way Rob had lived, quietly, kindly, with dignity. People began to embrace, tight, desperate hugs that said what mouths couldn't. Tears dropped into the sand. Faces turned toward the sea. And as the beach slowly emptied, each person walked away carrying the same image in their mind, Rob and Michelle together, not as headlines, not as tragedy, but as love, a family shattered by something unthinkable, yet held together by one final peaceful wish. And still, the grief didn't begin at the podium. It began days earlier, on the morning the news first spread. And in the moment, Billy Crystal arrived before the world could even name the pain. In the end, Billy's words didn't try to summarize a legendary career. They left behind something much heavier, a question. How will we live? So that when we're gone, the memory we leave is warm enough for others to hold on to. Before the beach, before the candles, before Billy Crystal stood shaking at a podium with the ocean behind him. There was December 14th, 2025. That was the day the news spread fast and hit like a punch to the chest, confirming what no one wanted to believe. Rob Reiner was 78, Michelle was 70. They were found deceased inside their Brentwood home in Los Angeles. And authorities confirmed something even more horrifying. This was not being treated as a natural loss. It was a homicide. An investigation began immediately. The industry, built on noise and celebration, went quiet because this wasn't just tragedy. This was violence landing inside a family home. Then another detail surfaced. Their daughter was the first to discover the devastating scene. Concern had grown when contact couldn't be made. The silence felt wrong, so she went. And what she found changed the Reiner family forever. Not long after, police identified their youngest son, Nick Reiner, as the suspect. He was taken into custody. The court process began almost immediately. His legal team requested a delay at the initial hearing, and the judge approved it, setting the tone for a case that would move slowly, carefully, and under the weight of the most serious charges under the law. For the Reiner family, it was more than grief. It was grief tangled with shock, betrayal, confusion, and a kind of pain that couldn't be explained to the public without tearing themselves apart all over again. And that's why the family made the decision that is stunned everyone. No public funeral, no media, no cameras. Because how do you stand in front of the world and say goodbye when the story of how they died is still under investigation, still unfolding, still ripping open new wounds by the hour? They chose a private farewell, not to hide Rob and Michelle, but to protect what little peace they had left. And yet, even as the legal system moved forward, another truth emerged, one that complicated everything, because court documents and family statements would later reveal something the public didn't fully understand at first. Nick Reiner had been living with a serious mental health condition, one that had worsened in the period leading up to the tragedy. Changes in treatment meant to help stabilize him were said to coincide with increasing confusion, emotional instability, and erratic behavior. Those close to him described it as if he was slowly drifting away from reality and no one could reach him in time. Alongside that, there was also mention of a long history of substance dependency, an ongoing battle that had never fully resolved. The family had tried, encouraging treatment, recovery, stability. At times, there was hope. But when mental health struggles overlap with addiction, the ground beneath everyone can become dangerously fragile. And then, reason and control give way to chaos. Now, the justice system faced an impossible balance: actions, intent, and mental capacity, while a family tried to process the kind of loss that doesn't come with closure. In the end, there was no grand ritual, no dramatic finale, no moment where grief was neatly folded into something the world could understand. Because real loss doesn't wrap itself up like a movie. It lingers, it echoes, and it changes the shape of everyone who touches it. That private farewell on the Malibu beach didn't close the story. It opened a long chain of goodbyes, one quiet moment after another, each person leaving with something they couldn't put into words. Tight embraces, tears sinking into the sand, faces turned toward the sea as if the ocean could hold what their hearts no longer could. And maybe that's why it felt so unbearable. Rob Reiner and Michelle didn't leave this world with noise, yet the space they left behind felt vast, so vast that even time would struggle to fill it. Rob was remembered not only as a great director, but as a deeply decent human being, someone who made people feel safe, seen, understood. In every tear-filled glance, every quiet pause between words, people recognized the same truth. He had touched lives in ways that lasted. And maybe what remains after everything isn't only grief, but a question Billy Crystal seemed to ask on behalf of everyone still here. How will we live so that when we're gone, the memory we leave is warm enough for others to hold on to? So now we ask you, what do you remember most about Rob Reiner? A film, a line of dialogue, a moment that stayed with you longer than you expected? Leave a comment below so we can remember together. And if this story moved you, please like the video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that honor the lives behind the legends. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very last lines, because sometimes listening is also a way of paying tribute.